How to do world building at a large scale. Welcome to Worldbuilding Mastery, where I aim to teach you everything I know about world building. No AI is used on this channel. Today, I'll go over world building projects of a very large scale, especially science fiction, but I'll touch on fantasy as well. We will cover large scale world building projects, what they are, the benefits and drawbacks of going to large scales with your projects, how to keep things small enough to be manageable, and finally, give you advice on how large your setting should be. I used to struggle a lot with this exact problem. I'd have the problem of creating settings that were like an ocean an inch deep, as they say. I'd end up with a whole lot of nothing, essentially. Big numbers, but no real substance to it. There was no feeling of weight behind those settings. Since then, though, I have learned how to handle it much better, and today I'm going to teach you everything I've learned about that. So let's begin. Part 1. What I mean by large scale. Now, world building is obviously very open-ended, right? You can create anything you can imagine. And because of that, you might be tempted to just create the biggest stuff you can imagine. This is very common, especially with science fiction, but something can happen in fantasy settings as well. Anytime that you add something to your setting, though, like a nation or technology or a magic system, anything, you are creating work for yourself. You need to bear this in mind. Because you will have to work on that thing in order for it to be detailed enough to contribute to your setting's lore. So the larger your setting is, the bigger of a problem that is, because anytime you add something to a large setting, you have to do more work. So when I think about world building projects and how I kind of scale them, I tend to think about it in terms of human population. For example, a typical medieval fantasy setting might only have a few 100 million humans, or human analogues like elves or whatever, spread across the entire planet. Meanwhile, a science fiction setting, with a galaxy-spanning empire could feasibly support essentially arbitrary population sizes. 100 million stars in a galaxy, most of which probably have planets. You do some maths and you realize that, they could probably support quadrillions of people, or quintillions, or sextillions, however you do the maths on that. When I thought about doing classic galactic empires, planet galactic empires, not even ignoring things like Dyson spheres, I typically do order it, I typically do imagine it being on the order of a quintillion or a sextillion. Although, this is why I tend not to do galaxy scale world building projects, is because it's just too big, and that's even without mentioning stuff like Dyson spheres. So that's really what I mean by large scale world building projects. It's where things get just so vast and so outside of normal human comprehension that we have no real world comparisons to draw from. Fantasy settings can do this as well, and it's not really about the numbers, as we'll see. Because the number you put on things is it's irrelevant. The human mind can't really comprehend it. Thing is, any world building project of any, reasonable scope is fundamentally beyond the human's ability to comprehend, or give any enormous amount of detail to, and that's something we'll get into. Part 2. The benefits and drawbacks of scale. So I've just been over a few of the challenges of large-scale world building, but there are certainly benefits to doing it as well. So here's a list of some pros and cons that I've come up with. So, pros. Number 1, big stuff is cool. It gives more weight and more momentum to everything that happens in the setting, and it can definitely enhance the experience. Everyone loves big stuff, right? And number 2, it can also allow for more complexity and interest, because when you have large-scale civilizations, large-scale stuff, you can do things, and this is the third advantage, you can do qualitatively different things. It allows for things like interstellar travel. Big civilizations can do stuff that small civilizations just fundamentally can't. They can build megastructures. They can do things. And number 4, you might be able to leave certain things vaguer than you would be able to do at a small scale. Like if you have vast expanses of space with civilizations in them, you can leave all of that vague as a backdrop, and you can get away with that more in a big setting in some ways. Because things are less interconnected in some ways. So those are kind of basically the pros of creating a larger world building project. Here are the cons. Number 1, it's hard to manage a large scale world building project. I mean, all of the cons are basically derived from this one. The setting can become, as I say, an ocean an inch deep. It's a vast kind of grey blob of nothing much in particular. On top of that, the second con, everything you add will take more work because, as I say, you'll have to consider the implications of everything you add on a larger scale. For some things, this doesn't really matter, but it matters for a lot of things. So that's something to bear in mind. Number 3, you are forced to leave certain things vague just necessarily. I listed this as a pro before, but it's actually, if you don't want to leave certain things vague, it can be a con. And number 4 is just there's a higher risk of burnout and just feeling overwhelmed by the amount of work that you create for yourself. It's easy to forget that many of the settings we love were created by like whole teams of people working full time for years or decades, Star Wars, Warhammer, etc. You can't replicate that as a single person working in your free time. So those are some of the pros and cons that I've identified in my experience with this subject. However, I will note that, as the old saying goes, it's not about size, it's about how you use it. Which is kind of funny, but in this context it means that you can do a lot with the setting that is relatively small in scale. Don't let her bully you. But conversely, you can also have a really big setting that doesn't feel meaningful. Having a large scale setting doesn't automatically mean you will reap the benefits of all the things that that are on the pros list. It also doesn't necessarily mean that you'll suffer from all of the cons I listed. And similarly, the inverse also applies. A small scale setting won't necessarily lose out on those things. It's about what you do with your setting. So, let me tell you how to do that. Part 3. How to keep things small. With large-scale settings, it is important to make sure that the things you present to the audience remain tangible and understandable, which means that they have to remain, in a certain sense, small. This actually applies to a setting of any size, though, because, as I say, all settings are large in scale, because beyond a certain point, the human mind only registers things as really big. We stop really understanding them. It's like the sun is much larger than even an elephant. Right? There's just no way to comprehend it. Really, any setting of meaningful size is just the world, and numbers you put on that don't really affect what I'm about to say very much. So, with large world-building projects, that is, any world-building projects, it's important to keep things small, and what I mean by that has nothing to do with numbers, and everything to do with comprehension. Humans cannot truly fathom forces beyond themselves, but they can understand how they affect them on a day-to-day level. So, for example, we can't comprehend a famine killing millions of people, but we can comprehend that our daily meat ration has been cut in half. We can't comprehend a post-scarcity economy, but we can comprehend the idea of having a dozen mansions. We can't comprehend ultra-complex technology and interconnected economic and industrial systems, but we can comprehend a big mech suit with a rail cannon. So for every large-scale force that shapes your setting, you need to show it with small examples, for the small is a microcosm of the large. Don't throw statistics at things. In-universe statistics and numbers can certainly be useful, and I do recommend having some, even just basic ones, but they aren't what makes a project meaningfully large-scale. What makes it large-scale is the complexity involved with those numbers. A medieval fantasy setting with hundreds of separate kingdoms with interconnected politics might well be far larger in scale than a generic United Nations in space type setting with thousands of times population. As tempting as it may be to want to replicate reality and go all in on complexity, it must be remembered that a world-building project is ultimately an artistic work first and foremost. And therefore, you do need to focus on serving a coherent artistic vision. I think it's best if there are consistent themes which apply at both the large scale and the small scale within a setting, and if the core concepts of a setting are ultimately simple and intuitively serve those themes. Complexity should be supplemental to a simple core. It should not dominate over it. A setting without a simple core will likely lose sight of that vision and will become incoherent. So, to give you a great example of all of this, is my all-time favourite film, Pacific Rim. Kaiju are fundamentally a representation of the concepts and forces which are too big for humans to deal with, right? Forces of nature, forces of atomic energy, forces of God. These forces exist in real life, things like weather, atom bombs, even, human ones like politics, feel very much outside of our control, right? So how do we deal with being at the mercy of the universe? Kaiju media kind of makes this tangible. It puts it into the form of a giant monster. is a form that humans can intuitively understand. And the point of kaiju media is that you are too small to do anything about the monster. Pacific Rim takes this theme and inverts it, saying that humans can defeat these big monsters through great effort. But instead of showing that with complex modern militaries fighting the monsters or anything like that, it takes the same approach of simplifying the human effort into a form that we can intuitively understand, the form of a giant robot. Vast technological economy and industrial effort humans can't understand, but giant robot we can understand. The abstract conflict between human effort and forces of nature, we can't understand that. But giant robot fighting giant monster, that we can understand. That scratches the itch in our caveman brain that just makes things click. Pacific Rim also does a very good job at just framing these fight scenes from a human perspective. Shots from the ground, or with frames of reference. Things have weight to them. Ultimately, all of this serves a theme, a counterpoint to historical kaiju media of sorts, saying that, yes, there are forces beyond ourselves, and yes, they do seem overwhelming often and terrifying, but there is something to be said for human effort, human struggle, human ingenuity, bravery, and cooperation that can ultimately overcome those forces. In the real world, that manifests in kind of invisible ways, right? It manifests in vaccines that save millions of lives, in natural disaster relief efforts, etc. But in Pacific Rim, you have a story which makes it comprehensible, which makes these big forces comprehensible. That's what you should strive to achieve. Part 4. How large should you go with your setting? Now, in some ways this doesn't really matter. As I say, any setting is a big setting. So go as big or as small as you want with it. I would advise against going too extreme, though. It's hard to specify this, but you need to have a sense of what the numbers you're working with actually mean, beyond just being really large. For my science fiction setting, I wanted to do something which appreciated the vastness of the cosmos, but which also remained restrained in scale and coherent. I felt that a human population on the order of 200 trillion, spread across 10 to 20,000 planets, seemed manageable enough for expressing that. One could go larger or smaller, but it wouldn't make much difference. As I say, these are just numbers. This is thousands of times the number of human beings who have ever lived in history, but there are ways of making it more manageable. Again, complexity is what matters for scale, so I looked for ways of limiting the sheer complexity of this to make it more manageable, but doing so in believable ways. So to give you an example of that, historically, people in different parts of the world were very isolated from one another and developed very independently. So you get an enormous amount of human diversity in the world today. In my setting, planets are generally colonized by one group and are extremely interconnected culturally and economically. So most planets are kind of largely a monoculture, with relatively little variation. Even among a planet of billions. This isn't quite a Planet of Hats situation, but this simplifies things, and I think it's believable. It simplifies things enough that I don't have to spend enormous lengths of time on every single planet in the setting. The setting as a whole can still feel complex, but it's not so complex that it becomes so unmanageable. Most planets in sci-fi, really in any setting, rarely have much diversity, and this is really the reason why. It's because if you tried to give an Earth's worth of detail to every planet in the galaxy, you would die long before you ever made a dent in such a project. So it's important to keep things simple. So what I'm trying to say with all of this is to know your limits and to know how to manage a setting of the scale that you're working with. If you have limited time to devote to world building and it's the kind of just a passing hobby for you, maybe don't try to make like a fully detailed galaxy with dozens of aliens and conflicting human factions with different ideologies and cultures and everything. Don't create more work for yourself than you can manage. If your setting feels too big, narrow your focus to a specific part of that you care most about. And again, it's okay to leave most things vague. I mean, it's unavoidable for a setting of any size, whether it's fantasy or science fiction or space opera or alternate history. Any world is too big for the human mind to comprehend. So any world that is created by one person will necessarily leave almost everything vague. It's just part of the process that you need to know what you're willing to leave vague and what aspects you need to detail the most. And lastly, this is just this me going off script, but I do think another aspect to this is you need to break the setting down into components. You need to compartmentalize it. That's what you need to do as well. But yeah, I think that's about all. That pretty much does it for this video. I'm really enthused by the attention that this channel has been getting recently. I've been getting a lot of requests to do a video about map design, so that will be coming up soon. But I hope this video has been helpful too. This video has been part of a series I've been doing on how to world build. If it's been helpful to you, then do go ahead and check out the rest of this series, because the advice I give in my other videos is just as good. If you're even more committed to improving your world building, then in the description below you'll find a link to my paid community, as there are greater resources that I can offer you there. The mission statement of World Building Mastery is to create the greatest community of world builders and writers on the internet, from whom the greatest artists of our generation will be born. If you want to be a part of that, that's the place to go. In any case, thanks for watching, and I'll have more content to come soon. Bye!